Hey everyone, and welcome back. You're ready for a deep dive that takes us from a time when walking was a spectator sport to some expert tips on how to find those lost keys, and finally to some pretty big news stories that might seem totally random at first, but I think you'll see how they all tie together.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how often we find echoes of the past in current events.
So first up, let's take a trip back in time.
Hmm.
Imagine it's the late 1800s, and stadiums are packed with people cheering on walkers.
Walkers.
Yeah, walkers. This was the era of pedestrianism, and it was a national obsession. We found this amazing article from the Smithsonian all about it.
It really makes you think about how ideas about entertainment and fitness and even celebrity have changed over time.
Okay, so according to the Smithsonian article, this whole craze started with a guy named Edward Payson Weston. He bet that Lincoln would lose the election. Well, Lincoln won, of course. And Weston ended up having to walk almost 500 miles from Boston to D.C. for the inauguration.
Wow, 500 miles.
Yeah. And get this, he almost made it in under 10 days.
That's incredible.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of set off this national craze.
Hmm.
People were just captivated by these feats of endurance.
I can see why. I mean, that's pretty impressive.
But it wasn't just about the physical challenge. The article highlights how pedestrianism was actually pretty diverse.
Mm.
Irish immigrants, Haitian immigrants, and even women were competing.
Wow. That's pretty progressive for that time.
Right. And that actually connects to what we're seeing today with the rise of these walking influencers.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. A lot of them are challenging traditional ideas about fitness and
Yeah.
making it more accessible, too.
It's like history repeating itself. The Smithsonian article even quotes this female pedestrian from the 1870s, Ada Anderson. She said, "It is good for women to see how much a woman can endure." Powerful statement.
Yeah, especially for that era.
Okay, now for something completely different. Have you ever lost something so important that you just panicked? Like your phone or your wallet?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think we've all been there.
Well, this next article from NPR gives 6 expert strategies to find missing objects. And these aren't just random tips, they're backed by science.
Interesting. So it's not just about retracing your steps and hoping for the best.
Right. One of the tips is to focus on what the experts call distinctive features. So instead of just frantically looking at everything, you really try to focus on the specific shape or color of what you lost.
So, like, if you lost your keys, you'd be looking for something metal and maybe a specific shape.
Exactly. And then there's this other technique about recreating the movements you made before you lost the item. So, like, if you can't find your keys, you actually walk back through your steps and try to mimic what you were doing.
I've heard of that. It's supposed to help you remember where you put things down.
Yeah, it's like tapping into your muscle memory. And sometimes the article says you literally need to change your perspective, like stand on a chair or crouch down low.
Anything to break out of your routine and see things in a new way.
Exactly. They even tell this story about a woman who accidentally threw her wedding ring out the car window.
Oh, no.
Yeah, during an argument. And the expert helped her find it by having her recreate the throwing motion.
Wow, that's amazing.
It really is. It makes you think about how our emotions can really affect our actions and even our memories.
That's true. You know, all these strategies about searching for things, it makes me think about how we handle all the information we're bombarded with every day. It's like we're constantly searching for the truth or the most important insights, but it's easy to get lost.
That's a great point. It's like we need to become expert searchers, not just for our lost keys, but for reliable information in this crazy world.
Absolutely. We need to be more careful about what we believe and where we get our information from.
Well, speaking of crazy and mixed up, let's move on to some news stories that might seem completely unrelated. We've got secession movements, hurricanes, social media bans, and big tech facing legal trouble.
Sounds like a lot to unpack.
It is. So first up, 7 counties in Illinois just voted to explore secession from Cook County. It's basically a rural versus urban thing. They want more control over their own destinies.
That's interesting. It reminds me of that tension between centralized power and local autonomy.
Right. Okay, next we're going to Cuba, where Hurricane Rafael just slammed into the island and knocked out the entire power grid.
Yeah, the whole island.
Yeah, the whole island is in the dark. It really highlights how vulnerable we are to these powerful storms.
And climate change is probably making them even worse.
Definitely a wake-up call. Now, from the Caribbean to Australia, where the government is considering banning social media for kids under 16, they want to protect children from harmful content, but it's causing a lot of debate.
That's a tough one. Social media can be harmful, but it can also be a powerful tool for connection and learning.
It's all about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
And finally, we're back in the U.S., where the future of Google might be in, wait for it, Trump's hands.
What? How did that happen?
Well, apparently Trump has suggested that breaking up Google might not be a good idea.
Wow. That's a big change from his previous stance.
It is. So we've gone from watching people walk in circles for entertainment to pondering the fate of one of the most powerful companies on the planet. And somehow it all feels connected.
It is connected. It's all about power. Who has it, who wants it, and how they use it. Whether it's political power, access to resources, or control over information, these are the forces that are shaping our world.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about. We'll be back with the second part of this episode to break down these news stories even further, so stay with us.
Welcome back to our deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about some pretty big news stories, and I think it's worth taking a closer look. Let's start with that secession movement in Illinois. 7 counties voted to explore splitting from Cook County, basically saying, Chicago, you're on your own.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold move. It really makes you think about representation and, the balance of power within a state. So what are the arguments for and against this split?
Well, the people who want to secede argue that Cook County and especially Chicago has too much power, and they don't represent the values or interests of the more rural areas. They say they'd have more control over their own laws and taxes if they were their own state.
So it's like they feel like they're being ignored.
Exactly. But then you have the people who are against secession, and they have some good points too. They say that splitting the state would weaken Illinois as a whole. And then there's the whole logistical nightmare of how to divide everything up.
Yeah, it's not just about drawing a line on a map, is it?
No, it's not. And then there's the question of what happens next. If Illinois splits, could that encourage other regions to do the same?
It's a question of what holds a nation together.
Exactly.
Right.
Okay, so moving on to Hurricane Rafael in Cuba. The entire power grid went down. Millions of people are in the dark.
It's hard to imagine what that's like.
It really shows how much we depend on these systems that we usually take for granted. Cuba's power grid has had problems before, and this hurricane just shows how important it is to have strong infrastructure, especially with climate change, making these storms more intense.
Yeah, the article mentioned this was the second hurricane to hit Cuba in just a few weeks.
That's awful. It must be so difficult for people to recover from one disaster and then get hit with another. And it also raises questions about global responsibility.
What do you mean?
Well, Cuba is a developing country that's been hit hard by the pandemic and U.S. sanctions. And now they're dealing with these hurricanes, which are probably made worse by climate change, something they didn't really contribute to.
So it's not just an environmental issue, it's a social justice issue.
Exactly. Now let's talk about Australia. They're debating whether to ban social media for kids under 16. They want to protect children, but not everyone agrees with this idea.
It's a tough one. Where do you draw the line? Is a ban really the best solution?
There are strong arguments on both sides. There's evidence that too much social media can be bad for kids' mental health. Things like cyberbullying, body image issues, and even addiction.
And it's not like social media companies have been doing a great job of dealing with those problems.
That's true.
Right.
But some people say that banning social media won't work. Kids will find ways around it. And social media can also be a good thing for connecting with people, learning new things, and even activism.
So we need to find a way to use it responsibly.
Right. It's about teaching kids how to think critically and make good choices online. It's about having open conversations about the risks and benefits of social media.
And now for our last news story. The future of Google. And get this, it's somehow tied to Trump.
Wait, what? Fill me in.
Apparently, Trump has hinted that maybe breaking up Google isn't such a good idea after all.
That's a pretty big change. Didn't the Department of Justice start that whole antitrust lawsuit against Google when he was in office?
Yeah, they did. It was all about Google being too dominant and stifling competition.
So just a refresher, what exactly are antitrust laws and why does the government get involved in breaking up companies?
Basically, antitrust laws are there to prevent monopolies and make sure there's competition. The idea is that if one company gets too big, it can hurt consumers and other businesses.
So they're saying that Google is too big and too powerful.
Right. But it's complicated. Some people think that breaking up Google would actually be a bad thing and could slow down innovation.
And now we have Trump, who's had this up and down relationship with Google, potentially changing the whole game.
It's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if these decisions are really about what's best for the country or if it's all about politics.
It's definitely a question worth asking.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up this deep dive. And, it's amazing how we started talking about walking as a spectator sport, and now we're discussing the future of the internet. But as we've seen, it all comes back to those same questions of power control and access, especially when we think about that last story, the future of Google.
Right. It really raises some questions about what's going to happen to the internet. Will it stay open and free? Or will we see more government control censorship?
I mean, some countries like China already have a really controlled internet.
That's true. And it seems like more and more governments are thinking about going in that direction. They want to deal with things like data privacy, misinformation, hate speech. But sometimes it feels like they're going too far.
So what would that even look like for us, if the internet became more controlled?
Well, imagine a world where it's harder to find information. Certain websites are blocked. The stuff you see online is filtered or censored by the government.
That sounds kind of scary. It would be harder to connect with people to see different viewpoints. It could even affect free speech.
It's a real concern. But of course, there are also those real harms that happen online. Hate speech, fake news, even calls for violence. So how do you balance that with keeping the internet open and free?
It's a tough question. There's no easy answer.
Right. We need to figure out how to hold those big tech companies accountable, but without censorship. And we need to teach people how to be smart about what they see and read online.
So it's not just about the government or the big companies. We all have a role to play.
Exactly. We need to think about the information we consume, who we trust, how we interact with people online. It's about being a responsible digital citizen.
This has been a really interesting deep dive. We've talked about so many different things, from those competitive walkers in the 1800s to the future of the internet. And I think the main takeaway is that the struggle for power control and access is something that's always been with us. It's shaping our world in so many ways.
It's true. And I think the future of the internet, and maybe even democracy itself, depends on us being informed, engaged, and willing to speak up.
That's a great point. Well, that's all the time we have for today. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive, and we encourage you to keep thinking about these issues, keep learning, and keep the conversation going. Until next time, keep diving deep.